Thank you for listening in to this episode of the podcast of the History Teachers Association of New South Wales. My name's Jonathan Dallimore, and today we're joined by Professor Mark Edele, who is the Hansen Chair in History at the University of Melbourne. Mark has authored many books on the history of Stalinism in the USSR, including Stalinist Society in 2011, the Soviet Union, A Short History in 2018, along with many others. In this interview, Mark and I discussed his forthcoming publication, Debates on Stalinism, which is published by Manchester University Press. This particular book is an introduction to the historiography of Stalinism that I think should be a high priority on the reading list of anyone who teaches Soviet history in this period. It is extremely well written and provides an accessible and quite comprehensive introduction to the English language historiography of Stalinism, which most teachers will find useful. Mark is a very generous historian. He's been a great supporter of history teachers in Western Australia, Victoria, where he now lives and works, and also at the national level. I'd like to thank Mark for his support and contributions to the history teaching community, and also like to thank Liz McGuinness from Canberra, who first put me in touch with Mark at the National Conference of the History Teachers Association in 2018. Remember, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes and SoundCloud, but for now I hope you enjoy this interview with Professor Mark Edele. Hi Mark, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, thanks for having me.
Let's start with the present day. I thought we'd sort of take a bit of a different approach here to your book and think about what's happening now with Stalin particularly. So how is he remembered 100 years after the Russian Revolution? A lot of people would say there's a sort of a re-Stalinization in Russia taking place, but there's a sort of set of counter-arguments to that. What do you think about that?
Well, there is sort of a re-Stalinization insofar which comes through the recovery of the Great Patriotic War, as the Russians still call the war against Germany as part of the Second World War. And that has become the center of kind of officially promoted Russian national consciousness. And you can't really talk about this war and this victory and this achievement of the Soviet Union, or as it's now seen, Russia, right, in winning the war in Europe and defeating fascism or National Socialism, without Stalin, who was the leader of the war. So that's in many ways, the first step of that re-Stalinization is Stalin as the competent manager of victory. And that's very strongly supported by the state and by many historians as well, like patriotic Russian historians. And that has quite a bit of resonance in the population. So in the latest poll from 2018 from an independent pollster, Levada Center, Stalin, 40% of respondents report that they see Stalin with admiration, respect, or sympathy, 31% with indifference, and only 12% with dislike, anger, fear, disgust. 1% claim they do not know who he is, which I think is a great answer.
Are they answering that honestly, do you think?
Well, I doubt it, but yeah. And there's a series of other questions these pollsters are asking, but two others are quite interesting. I think one is if Stalin was a wise leader who made the USSR powerful and prosperous, and 57% of the respondents fully or mostly agree, and only 18% fully or mostly disagree, and a quarter say it's hard to say. And then another question where they're asking about the statement, regardless of mistakes and flaws, the fact that the Russians won the war is under Stalin's leadership is the most important. The respondents who mostly or fully agree with that is even higher, 64%, so as opposed to 57%. And only 14% say they disagree, so as opposed to 18% on the question of whether or not he was a wise leader. So people are not necessarily forgetting all the other things, all the crimes and so on, but they're kind of ready to forgive Stalin because of victory. So there are, of course, also outright Stalinists, right? And there are outright anti-Stalinists. Among historians, probably Oleksievnyuk should be mentioned here, who is taking a fairly strong position against this re-Stalinization. But it is bound up in the kind of recovery of a positive sense of Russian nationhood and Russian self, and it's just very hard to tell that story without Stalin, it turns out. And there, a bit of that I deal with in the chapter on World War II in Russia in the book.
Yeah, and if we kind of focus in a little bit more on, say, the sort of pre-war Stalinism material, in the book, what you do a great job of, I think, is talking through the scholars themselves more than the thematics and the stuff that you sort of often find in these books. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting was the comment you made about the notion that scholars who are working on post-war Stalinism tend to be more collegial than those working on the 1930s. And I thought that was a really interesting observation. Is there something, do you think, about this period before the war where, Stalin obviously emerges as popular from this period, but is there something about that 1930s foundational period that makes it really contentious?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I was thinking about that question, why that is. Because it's not a question of generations, for example. You get a similar mix of generations of scholars in the post-war, in the pre-war years. It's not politics. You get a similar kind of mixture of politics. But there's something about the 30s, which I think, first of all, the question of the relationship between Leninism and Stalinism, between the Russian Revolution and Stalinism, is just sort of no longer there in the post-war years. It's not a live research question for people working on the post-war years, but it's a live research question still, or a question which is in the back of many people's minds for the 1930s. And that used to be a hugely contested and politically hugely fraught um, uh, question, because whether or not you said there's a sharp distinction between Leninism and Stalinism, or whether you said there's a continuity between the two, or maybe they're the same thing even, that had implications for the legitimacy of Leninism, the legitimacy of Marxist politics, the legitimacy of the Soviet Union when it still existed, the legitimacy of all kinds of left-wing revolutionary projects. So the Leninism-Stalinism relationship is one of them. The other one is, of course, the Great Terror, this big atrocity. Again, there is terror after the war, but it's quite a different terror with a few exceptions. I mean, there's a few moments where it looks like mini great terrors are happening again, but by and large, you have large-scale repression of everyday criminality, thefts, and stuff like that. So the explaining the Great Terror and worrying about the Great Terror is another of the reasons why the 30s are so contentious. And then I think another one, which I'm in the book I'm finishing at the moment, which is about Stalinism at war, World War II, I'm struggling with that question, and that's the question of whether or not the Stalin revolution was necessary in order to win the war. So the whole question of whether or not the Soviet Union could have won World War II without what happened under Stalin is another one which is constantly in the background. And I think these things together, plus the moment that people moved chronologically into the 1930s first. So historians worked on the revolution, they worked on the 20s, and then they worked on the 30s. So by the time the 30s became a discussion point, the Cold War was still really quite alive, right, in the 1980s. And, it was the years of Reaganism and so on. So the politicization of those years around the Soviet Union, which then galvanized all of this, I think, into. So I don't think it has anything to do with the people as much as with the context in which the 1930s were discussed, I think.
One of the really interesting things about this book that I found was that you have obviously structured it, as I said, around the biographies of the scholars that kind of make up the historiography, and they become a really important part of the way you explore all of the themes and so on of Stalin historiography. And so you've obviously got right into researching their lives and the way that they've come to their conclusions and so on. And I thought you made a really interesting point about avoiding this simplistic notion that national heritage is the defining feature or even the primary defining feature of a historian's interpretation. And you use the example of these Polish emigres who become quite important figures in the historiography of Stalin. So Richard Pipes, Moshe Levine, Isaac Deutscher, and Adam Ulam. I just wondered if you could briefly capture that argument about national heritage and historiography and historians' interpretations.
Well, I mean, the question about the Polish immigrants, many of them are often Polish Jews. Richard Pipes, Moshe Levine, Isaac Deutscher, Adam Ulam, and often people who just escape before World War II breaks out, or at the beginning of World War II, or in the case of Moshe Levine during World War II. So that shapes, of course, their approach to Stalinism in many ways, and I think the Polish eye on Stalinism was quite useful because it could take a third position between National Socialism on the one hand and Stalinism on the other. And sometimes, there's sometimes polemics breaking out saying, oh, this is just because, Richard Pipes has been accused of that, funnily or ironically, by Moshe Levine, that it's just, he's so hostile to the Soviets because he's Polish. And originally, I thought, in a way, those two would make a nice pair because both of them experience shortly occupation, German occupation, or just so escape of it. So Pipes escapes through Germany under an assumed identity, then to the United States, and Levine goes to the Soviet Union, and then via France and Israel and Britain, and eventually ends up in the US as well. And so originally I thought, oh, it would be a nice chapter because the one who becomes the left-wing historian of Stalinism, Levine, goes to the Soviet Union, right? And the one who becomes the right-wing historian of the Soviet Union, Pipes, does not experience the Soviet Union. But of course, Levine is a leftist before he leaves, and Pipes is, much further to the right before he leaves. So it doesn't work so nicely. But what all of this led me to is to think much more about the idiosyncrasies of these individual historians, rather than sort of some kind of stereotype about their nationality, their religion, their social class, their generation, or their gender, in fact, but think much more about how their kind of intellectual formation made them write the kind of history they ended up writing. And that, of course, gets you much more into intellectual biography, which I'm doing for 3 case studies in the book, for Pipes, for Levine, and for Fitzpatrick. All of them also are, and that's another theme of the book, all of them are migrants, right? Intellectual and actual migrants. So they all end up in the United States, but their intellectual formation is not confined to the United States. So it begins for Levine and Pipes, it begins in Eastern Europe. For Levine, it continues into the Soviet Union, into Israel, and Britain. Fitzpatrick is an Australian from kind of a Australian left-wing milieu who goes to the UK and then Moscow, and then also ends up in the US. So I was interested really in the kind of transnational aspect of that as well, how people bring this intellectual baggage of their lives with them, and then very often don't understand each other because their formation is so different. And I guess I'm also interested in this because I have not as dramatic an experience, but also an experience of transnational intellectual formation as a German who was trained in the US and is living now in Australia. So yeah, I guess that's a very long-winded answer to that question. That what it led me to is kind of intellectual biography in many ways, which of course you can only do so much of, right?
Yeah, and I thought one of the good things about that was that it did. I mean, I've found myself saying things like that before about Richard Pipes. He's Polish working in America and for Reagan at some point, so therefore that's got to influence what he says. But maybe it's the other way around. Maybe there's this other story going on in the construction of his arguments. So I thought that was a good way to really challenge how we talk about these historians, actually. Yeah. And one of the central arguments of the book, probably I thought it one of the most important in some ways, was this idea that the sort of well-worn, totalitarian, revisionist, post-revisionist story that we often tell about Stalin historiography is a bit misleading. And I think at some point you actually call it a kind of a mythologized version of the historiography that has been created by social historians, I think was the point you made. Why doesn't that work in your view?
Well, I mean, it works in a certain way if you follow the if you like the reading list, which is usually provided by people who like to tell that story as a kind of a story of a history of the present, right? This is how we got here, and if you want to tell that story, you say, there was Hannah Arendt, who knew very little about the Soviet Union, but a little bit about Nazi Germany, but was a philosopher. And then you have Friedrich and Brzezinski, who are really sort of model builders, who also know fairly little about the Soviet Union. And then you get the historians, the revisionists, and they, for the first time, actually, they all go to the Soviet Union, and as researchers, right? And they actually read the sources, and so you get a real image then of the Soviet Union. And then you get the post-revisionists who build on that by going back to talking about ideology and so on. But if you change the reading list and look actually at some of the really formative books which have been written about Stalinism in the 50s and 60s, so during the time of totalitarianism scholarship, they all use the term. So there's Raymond Bauer and Alex Inkelis, How the Soviet System Works, of 1956, and the companion volume, also Inkelis and Bauer, The Soviet Citizen, 1961. These are based on what we would call now oral history. So they interviewed large numbers with a team, large numbers of DPs who had displaced persons who had escaped the Soviet Union, and they were very interested in everyday life, in all kinds of revisionist themes like social mobility, loyalty, resistance, informal exchange, everyday connections. How do you, they ask them things like, so how do you get stuff? How do you get your child into university? What do you need to do? Corruption, lack of state control, unintended consequences, and so on. So these are all themes the revisionists developed very strongly, and they all read these books and then forgot about them and focused on the kind of politicized version of the totalitarian model. Or, I mean, a really influential book, Merle Feinsod, Smolensk Under Soviet Rule of 1958, which is a real social history of Smolensk region based on archival research of the Smolensk archive, which the Nazis had taken from the Soviet Union and the Americans captured from the Nazis, and therefore Western scholars had it. So once you read these things, that story no longer makes any sense, but it looks much more like what the revisionists did. They read all the literature that was there about the Soviet Union. They assimilated all the good research and the insights of that literature, and then they focused their critique on the politics and on all the silly stuff, which, every generation of scholars has its silliness, right? You can always focus on that. So I was much more interested in teasing out these continuities and sort of pulling away from that straw man, which the historians built about the work of that earlier generation of scholars who were largely political scientists, sociologists, anthropologists, psychologists, so more from the social sciences. And that construction of the totalitarian strawman, if you like, then was taken over by a group of cultural historians who then started to call themselves post-revisionists, who basically adopted that narrative but turned it into kind of nearly a Hegelian narrative of moving from darkness to light, from the thesis of totalitarianism to the antithesis of revisionism to, the happy synthesis of their own work. So in many ways, I because I also cannot find myself in this narrative, right? So I think that was one of the reasons to begin unpacking it and looking a bit more at the continuities and the complexities of that whole story.
Maybe a sort of a more direct question then. Do you think the notion of totalitarianism is still useful? And not in the sense that, there are some people who do, but I'm asking about your own analysis. Do you think it's still a worthwhile concept?
Yeah, I mean, I use it, and a increasing number of scholars have used it since the 80s. It has come back with, I mean, that's one of the funny things about this story, is that the notion of totalitarianism, once it had been declared dead, like some sort of zombie, came back, and it came back through Eastern Europe, very much through Eastern European dissidents who embraced that concept. And I do think it continues to be quite useful to talk about Stalinism in particular, and to also see Stalinism apart from, let's say, the 1920s, and then what happens after Stalin's death, which I think are, there's still clearly dictatorships and so on, but I find it very hard to describe them as totalitarian. So I think it still does interesting work to think about extreme forms of dictatorship and less extreme forms of dictatorship, as long as we see totalitarianism to mean a regime which tries to claim total mobilization of all of society and total mobilization of all individuals down to, their souls, to use Johann Helbeck's nice metaphor. So that is a particularly intrusive, but also for many people quite empowering form of dictatorship. I think the problem becomes if we then take it as a reality of total control, which never, of course, happened. So I think if we take this kind of view of totalitarianism, that works and is consistent with both the old totalitarianism literature, but also much of the revisionist and post-revisionist scholarship. So I think it's a useful term, I think, for the Stalin years.
One of the interesting parts of the story in this book as well is the kind of development of different schools of thought beyond totalitarianism, I suppose, is one way to put it. And you sort of follow different scholars into different parts, particularly of the US. And one particularly important concept I thought that might be worth briefly discussing is this notion of the Chicago School and the Columbia School. How are they different?
Well, I mean, again, a little bit like totalitarianism and revisionism, they're kind of shorthands and crutches for much more complex situations. For one, I mean, the Chicago School refers basically to people who were trained by Sheila Fitzpatrick at the University of Chicago, at the time the largest postgraduate program for people working on the Soviet Union, historians working on the Soviet Union. I come out of that school, and a whole cohort of scholars come out of that school. The other school, which is then often constructed in opposition to that school, is the Columbia School, which was a group of people who were trained at Columbia and who were deeply influenced by Stephen Kotkin. They are much more inspired usually by cultural history. Many of them have worked on modernity, that is the Soviet Union as a modern state, and a state that can be compared to other modern states around the globe. They are often a bit more interested in theorizing than the Fitzpatrick students, who often tend to use more social science theories, if they use any theories at all. But for one, there's a lot of overlap between these groups. It's not that they constantly fight each other or something. Many of them are friends or good colleagues. Plus, there's of course a variety of other centers of training of historians of the Soviet Union. In the U.S., I mean, Berkeley was very important. Increasingly now, Princeton, and of course, there's several German centers, Russian centers, Ukrainian centers, British centers. So I think there was a moment in the 2000s where there was a bit of a polemic between these two schools, but in a certain way, I think that moment has passed, and the landscape, the intellectual landscape in the U.S., let alone the rest of the world, of Stalinism scholars is much more diverse than this kind of nice, dichotomy between these two schools would imply, I think.
Yeah, no, I found that helpful as well, and I've read your earlier essay where you talked about Jeffrey Hosking's kind of place within the scholarship, which I really like, because that was, I think, probably, I mean, I don't know if I can pick one, but it's probably one of my favorite books of Soviet history. That just narrative history of the USSR. I bought it in a secondhand bookshop many years ago, and I just found it such an interesting and nuanced story, so accessible but really interesting, and so. I sort of like that earlier essay where you really push beyond this notion of, like there are these couple of centers of authority and they're in combat. You sort of push it beyond that, which is really good.
And I mean, Hosking is quite interesting, right? Because he's a prime example of somebody who shouldn't exist. I mean, he's a social historian of the Soviet Union who is embracing the concept of totalitarianism according to the narrative that shouldn't exist, right? He's the wrong generation. He's doing the wrong kind of history under the wrong kind of theoretical framework. So the story just doesn't work for him. That's, I think, I mean, I used that his textbook for the Soviet Union textbook for long years as my textbook sort of for my survey course, and first at the University of Western Australia, and it then went out of print and had to use something else I didn't like so much, and then I ended up writing my own because I was so frustrated. But yeah, I'm a great fan of Hosking's work as well.
So where do you see yourself just generally fitting into the wider scholarship? Because now you've got quite a catalogue of, you've got your survey history of the USSR, but you've got Stalinist society. There's a whole range of things that you've been working on over the last few years. Where do you see yourself fitting into all this?
Well, you could just put me into the Chicago school and then, everybody would have a nice box.
Yeah.
I used to describe myself as a cultural historian, then as a social historian. But then I started to write, other stuff which was much more political history or military history or sometimes legal history. So I have no, my methodology is pretty eclectic. I don't have a preferred kind of source base. It's more like trying to find the sources to be able to kind of tell the part of that history or to answer some question I have about that history. So I find myself a bit hard to classify. It might actually be easier for people outside myself, because self-knowledge is pretty complicated thing. I do think that, one could probably describe myself as being part of that group of neo-totalitarian scholars who are re-embracing that term totalitarianism for the Soviet Union, but that is a very, very diverse group, right? So, and you would find people in the Columbia School and in the Chicago School who do that, and outside of it. So, and again, I was originally trained in Germany. My time in Russia, or more recently now in Ukraine and the Baltic states, have shaped my sensibilities. And I was trained at the University of Chicago. So in a way, it's again a bit of a idiosyncratic probably story, but it's quite possible that from the outside, you could actually classify me into a group of scholars I'm just not aware of, I think.
But that's I think, an important point that I think you're trying to make in this book is sort of resisting the simple option of just packaging people up and putting them on a shelf and it's all neat and tidy. This is one of the, I thought, strengths of the approach you took in looking at people rather than themes as the first point of contact, is that you could really actually build a picture of them as people that was far more nuanced than the opposite way, where you start with some themes and you put people in those categories and you talk about their work. So maybe it's a good example. Your own story is a good example of what you're trying to communicate in the book in some ways.
That's quite likely, given that, I mean, if I'm right, and the kind of histories we write are a lot about our own experience as well, then it would only be logical that my own experience shapes the approach I'm taking to that, which is basically a history of the writing of the history of Stalinism, right? A history of the English language literature on that.
One figure I'd like to talk a little bit about specifically, primarily because I think he's sort of casting such a shadow over the field at the moment, especially from a public point of view, I guess, is Stephen Kotkin. And clearly, I think he's trying to position himself as this kind of pinnacle of Stalin studies with that massive 3-part biography I think he's still working on, 2 parts at least out, I'm sure of.
Two parts out. The third is announced for the end of the year. We shall see. That will be the hardest volume, actually. It covers the war and post-war years, which is going to be a handful to deal with.
Well, he's certainly an ambitious man. That's not really a secret, I think. And I think one of the things that I read in your work, and I've read in other essays that you've written, I don't want to put this too strongly because I don't want to put words in your mouth, but there's this sense of hesitation about some of the things that he does in some of these books. Can you maybe just flesh out some of the strengths and weaknesses you see in his work as a scholar of Stalin?
Well, I think he's a really talented essayist. Some of his essays, I mean, one of them is what originally made him really famous is a chapter in his book, which came out of the dissertation, Magnetic Mountain, called "Speaking Bolshevik," which coined a whole phrase which everybody is reusing, which encapsulates something about living in the Soviet Union, that you learn to speak, think, act in a certain way. So that's 1995, a very, very influential a chapter, but really a very strongly essay-like chapter. And there's 2 others I would like to particularly highlight. One is Modern Times, the Soviet Union and the Interwar Conjuncture of 2001, which really pushed the line of thinking comparatively about the 1930s, but not comparatively like the old totalitarian literature did, compared to Nazi Germany only, but compared to, a whole range of societies, including the United States, including Europe, and looking at, mass society, mass consumption, mass culture as something that comes together in the 30s, and of which the Soviet Union is one variant. So that, and then finally, there's an essay called "The State Is It Us" from 2002, which is about thinking through how individuals experience themselves as part of the Stalinist state. And those essays have inspired a lot of people to argue with or against him, and they've made really an enormous impact. A lot of people love his books as well. I find them by and large too long, and I think the pinnacle of that unrestraint of writing these incredible tomes, which will hurt your back if you have to carry them around, is that Stalin biography. And I mean, I much rather read Chlevniuk's Stalin biography, which is to the point, very, very tightly constructed, thought through, rather than this expansive thing, which is actually not a Stalin biography. It's a history of the world centered around Stalin. So I think you're right. It's an attempt at showing mastery and showing leadership in the field, and that's okay, but maybe I'm not a particularly good follower or something. I don't know. I mean, the other thing, there is also a kind of a sort of a cult of personality about the God Professor around all of this, which I maybe feel uneasy about. I mean, the idea that, one historian will be able to explain everything to us. I mean, one gets into that habit as a university lecturer where you constantly tell the students what is the case and so on. But in reality, the richness of historical insight comes from diversity of people doing a diverse range of history. So yeah, I guess I don't feel particularly compelled by that kind of claim of one scholar being, the top scholar who can explain everything, because history is such a big thing, and the history of Stalinism is so big and so disturbing and so complex that even if you write 5,000 pages about it, you will still not have it all. So I
No,
guess
I tend to agree, and I felt that the essays that some of them you mentioned, I found the most helpful of his work. So Modern Times, particularly, I found a really useful single essay that just pushed my thinking in a really important way. I think
yeah,
not that you necessarily agree with it, as you say, like all parts of it. There are people who are arguing against it, but it forced you to actually stop and consider some
yeah,
things.
no, I think that's right. And I mean, another really brilliant piece is, I mean, that's a book, but it's really an essay book, and a short book, yeah, shockingly, and that's Armageddon Averted, which is a brilliant kind of meditation about the reason for the end of the Soviet Union and what came after. So that again, I thought was a really, but that's not on Stalinism. That's sort of on a much later period.
You are a lot more upbeat and positive about Oleg Plevniuk's biography of Stalin. You said there that part of that is that it's brief and to the point. What else makes that such a good biography in your view?
It's extremely well researched. It's extremely well thought through. It's driven by a kind of a quite, in the contemporary Russian context, sort of useful, I think, an important anti-Stalinist sentiment, which is directed against this Stalin revival we've seen earlier. It's brilliantly constructed. I think it's a real literary masterpiece. I mean, when I read that thing, I thought, I wish I could do a book like that. And it's short. I mean, and I think that's important. I mean, there's the amount of books which come out all the time, and in order to, for anybody, even scholars, I mean, I'm paid to spend at least part of my week reading books, and it's extremely hard to keep up with scholarship. And it's partially, there's a kind of a new unrestrained. I think there used to be quite hardly enforced word limits, and somehow they have, maybe because production has gotten cheaper, or I don't know what it is, but we get these monster books, which often are more than one book made into one. And Hlevnuk has really resisted that, and he's written a well constructed, well thought through book. He knows what his points are, what he wants to convey, and then he moves on and writes another book about something else. But
Yeah, he's very productive, and I really like the fact that that book was short but also informative. You know how you think sometimes if a book's going to be short, it's just going to condense it down to the things that you need to know about whatever subject it's on. Whereas this, I thought was short, but then I was really learning quite a few things along the way as well, which I thought was genius. Yeah.
yeah, no, it's and he's very aware of his intellectual debts to various other historians, and sort of very humble in his self presentation. So that, I think, probably also helps in appreciation of the kind of the tone of the entire book, I think.
I want to ask two last questions of you, and one of them is kind of, I suppose, a bit more reflective of being a scholar of Stalinism, which I think must be a real challenge to kind of carry that identity around as a scholar. I think because it is such a controversial kind of part of history. Are there unique qualities you think that historians require to be good at being a historian of Stalinism, or something? Maybe even Hitler is a sort of a similar scenario. But when you're studying such big, controversial, difficult topics, do you need special qualities?
I don't know. I mean, certainly not different qualities, I think, from any other history worth studying, right? Because we study certain histories because they are controversial or disturbing or uplifting or something else. But there's reasons why we study certain histories and not others. And I think it's the same kind of intellectual discipline any historian would have to bring. And in a certain way, it's maybe actually easier if you study something you don't particularly like. Now, few people really like Stalinism. I mean, there are exceptions, but it's, I think, in many ways easier because you already have a critical distance than if you study something you really like. I don't know what that would be in my case, um, but
Well, a historian who's looking at, say, pop culture of music and other things like that might be easy to see how they get carried away with, maybe being less critical or something. Yeah, I take
yeah,
your
or
point.
often, if you would be as a admirer of Churchill, write a Churchill biography, or as a, a
Roosevelt or
yeah,
yeah.
or um, as a staunch nationalist writing your national history. I think uh, it's probably actually harder to do that well because you don't have a critical distance in the first instance. While if you study something you're not in love with, that's probably easier. That can also, of course, have its pitfalls because you might, simply not look at the good sides or something or not see them. But um, yeah, I don't think you need to be a particularly heroic historian or something. You just have to, have the patience to read the sources and read the historiography and make up your mind about this past and how you want to tell it. Um, I think the answer is no. You don't need special qualities which you wouldn't have to be a historian of anything else.
I don't think you're actually doing this intentionally in one sense, but as you're reading it, you can kind of get a sense of the pitfalls that some different historians have made for these reasons. They either felt too closely or they were obviously going out to paint a story that was going to end up with this conclusion, so they sort of fell into that trap. And I think it can be really complicated, but not necessarily, yeah, as you say, as more complicated as other
But
things.
but I think also, I mean, the other point I actually hope I'm making in the book is that the various passions people bring to their study of Stalinism are not a bad thing. You shouldn't be dispassionate about this, because then why would you do all of that work? I mean, it's time consuming and it's often hard and involves travel and boredom and so if you want if you wouldn't be passionate about something about this particular past, why would you do it? And so I hope that what I'm conveying in the book too is it's not the ideal of the dispassionate and apolitical historian. I mean, it's impossible, but it's also probably actually not very helpful because you want passion of some sort that drives you to learn more about the society. But you should then, hopefully you can then constrain that passion with some kind of colder intellectual instincts. But I mean, I don't know whether or not I can always contain my passions in this particular book, for example, about historiography, right? I mean, there's probably moments where you can feel that I maybe feel too strongly about something, right?
Actually, I didn't ask any questions about those, but there were some moments where I thought, okay, yeah, I can see you're subtly making a point here, but I I know what you're doing and I know who you're criticizing. I'll leave that for the listeners to sort of figure out which parts I'm thinking of there. That's up to them. But I like that as well, actually. Maybe for the same reasons that it's not a sort of a cold analytical process. These are people and they're dialoguing, and sometimes they're doing that in ways that are unhelpful and even in some cases I think downright rude and other things like that. So it's okay to point that out and say that's not cool. That's part of the conversation.
Yeah.
So last question might be a bit tricky to answer. It's a big one, in one sense, but I want to think about the secondary students that we're dealing with a lot on this end here, and they're coming to this topic that you're saying as a professional scholar is kind of daunting in its own ways. They're coming to this study as 17, 18, 19 year olds, whatever it is, for the first time perhaps. What are some of the things that you would just give them as pointers to sort of approach Stalin and Stalinism?
I mean, daunting is a nice word, right? And of course, if you approach something that's daunting, what you probably just need is fearlessness, complete fearlessness. Just throw yourself into that literature, read, and don't worry. This literature is so big, you will, unless you become a professional, you will never master the whole thing. It used to be possible. Ron Suney at the University of Chicago liked to tell us that his generation of scholars read everything that was written about the Soviet Union, because that was probably everything written about the Soviet Union in English, because even at that point, the bibliography on the Great Patriotic War, for example, is several volumes long, just a list of things that was published. But it was still possible to kind of know the historiography. That is today nearly impossible, unless you devote your life to it, and you have this incredible privilege to have an academic position which gives you at least part of the time where you're not a bureaucrat, which you're sometimes, and when you're not a teacher, but where you can just read. So you won't, as a high school student, you will not be able to conquer this literature, right? So just pick something about this that you find most interesting, and follow that interest. There's an enormous amount of literature out there now on all kinds of aspects of this society, and there's a lot of primary sources which are translated into English, which are available. So just forget your fear and just start reading and see where this gets you.
That's some great advice, Mark. We will leave it there. Can you just maybe quickly run us through where this book is going to be available and when? Because I know it's not out yet, but just maybe for the people who are listening, where they can find a copy and when it will be available.
It should be available in the next few months. It's called Debates on Stalinism. It's published by Manchester University Press. You could probably buy one on their website, but you will also be able to buy it from any of your preferred online bookshops. And if you're very lucky and you live in a city with a great bookshop will surely also sell it.
Thanks, Mark, for joining us, and wish you all the best for the book.
Thank you.